Recoil, is it the best state management library for React? Well, in today's video, I'm going to give you an overview of what Recoil is, what it's used for, and what good use cases are for it. And I'll ultimately give you my opinion on whether I think it's the best state management library for React. But then I will have future videos going over kind of more specifics of Recoil on how atoms work, how selectors work, and different things like that, which we'll briefly touch on in today's video. So first off, what is Recoil? Well, Recoil is a state management library for React, as you can see straight from the Recoil docs here. And it kind of has a few kind of main tenets that it mentions here. So first off, Recoil is fairly minimal and it's also React-ish. And I like their phraseology here. When using Recoil, it kind of feels like you're just using plain old React. And the way that it works is kind of similar to the way things in React work. And I'll kind of show you some examples of this in just a second. And it says, Recoil works in things like React. Add some to your app and get fast and flexible shared state. And that's what Recoil is really good at. It's allowing you to share state across your application without having to do things like prop drilling, or it prevents some not so great side effects of using context in React and different things like that. And then it also allows you to use pure functions and more efficient subscriptions. So this kind of prevents some of those issues that you get with using context in React. And then it also allows some other cool things like time travel debugging, routing, persistence, and being able to do some things without impairing code splitting. So let's dive in a little bit further to their docs here. And first off, let's kind of go over their motivation here. And what they kind of discuss here is, for reasons of compatibility and simplicity, it's best to use React's built-in state management and capabilities rather than global state. However, there are limitations to just using the state management within React. And when I say state management within React, I'm talking about using things like the useState hook within React, or the useReducer hook, and kind of using those built-in things, as well as using context for state management, which I would argue context isn't really great for state management and has kind of other purposes. But Recoil will also touch on some of these limitations, in which it says component state can only be shared among common ancestors. So in React, it has this architecture of a kind of tree-like structure in which to pass data across your app, you need to kind of pass it down that tree. So if you need state in one component over here and one component over on the other side of your tree-like data structure, it can be tricky to do that. And it might lead you to needing to put that state kind of high up in your tree and then kind of drill that all the way down your tree. And then if that state changes, it might re-render that entire tree, and it can make things a lot less kind of performant and just overall less maintainable and clean overall. And that's kind of what they talk about here, is you might have to push your state across your ancestors, and this might include a huge tree that needs to re-render. And then this point, it says context. So when you use context in React, it can only store a single value, not an indefinite set of values, each with its own consumer. So what I think that it's getting at here is, like, when you use context in React, well, anytime any value within that context changes, it's going to re-render anything that is subscribing to that context or anything that uses that context within your application. Whereas with Recoil, you can have all these kind of separate single values, and for things that use those values are independent of other things that are within Recoil. They're not all owned by a single context. And that prevents kind of re-rendering everything a whole bunch more, like you might when you're using context. And then also it talks about how both of these above things here that we just talked about, they make it difficult to code split the top of the tree where the state has to live, and separating that from the leaves of the tree where the state is used, which is also true. So they wanted to improve this by both keeping the API and the semantics and behavior as React-ish as possible. So they wanted to kind of solve these limitations here, but they still wanted to have Recoil kind of feel like you're just using internal React, which I would say it definitely does. So they go on to say, Recoil defines a directed graph orthogonal to, but also intrinsic and attached to your React tree. So that's a lot of words I don't understand. So continuing on here, state changes flow from the roots of this graph, which they call atoms, through pure functions, which they call selectors, and into the components. With this approach, we get a boilerplate free API where shared state has the same simple get set interface as React local state. So it still feels very React-ish. And I feel like them saying boilerplate free API here is almost like a shot at Redux, because if you've used Redux before for state management, you know that a lot of boilerplate comes with that. So shots fired there from Recoil. And then they talk about how we have the possibility of compatibility with concurrent mode and new React features, which is really cool. The state definition is incremental and distributed, making code splitting possible. So you kind of can keep these atoms in individual pieces, and it's not like all connected through your tree, which makes code splitting a lot easier. State can be placed with derived data without modifying the components that use it. Derived data can move between being synchronous and asynchronous without modifying the components that use it. We can treat navigation as a first-class concept, even encoding state transitions and links. It's easy to prevent the entire application state in a way that's backwards compatible, so persisted states can survive application changes. So those are some of the benefits that Recoil promises. Now, overall, if we kind of look at this core concepts, and my future videos are going to cover atoms, selectors, and different hooks within Recoil more specifically, and we're going to have this all on a playlist that you can view. But just as an overview here, Recoil lets you create a data flow graph that flows from atoms. So these atoms are going to be like your shared pieces of state that you can share throughout your application. And the way that you can share these is through selectors. And these are just going to be pure functions that are going to allow you to use this shared state. And it says atoms are units of state that components can subscribe to. And then selectors transform this state either synchronously or asynchronously. And then here it kind of gets into defining different atoms and selectors and how to use it. And then also, if you kind of look at this API reference here for state, just in this drop down here, you can see how it has like use recoil state, use recoil value, use set recoil state. So it has all these custom hooks that if you look at this API, looks very similar to some of the different hooks within React, like use reducer, use state, use context, and different things like that. Now, it is important to note that this Recoil package is still in development, and I'm sure that they're still kind of working out the kinks of it. But overall, what's kind of my opinion on it? Do I think it's the best state management in React? Well, best is hard to say. Like, it's going to depend from use case to use case, and depending on someone's situation, depending on someone's development team. Like, if everybody already knows Redux and you're already using that in your app, do I think it's best to rewrite all that for Recoil? Maybe not. But do I think that for a lot of applications, Recoil is a very intuitive state management library that allows you to share data across your kind of component hierarchy, and it prevents you from needing to use context, which kind of comes with some maybe not so good trade-offs? Yeah. And do I generally like using Recoil? Absolutely. I think that it fulfills the use case of shared data very well in your application, and it allows you to manage state very well. And I think that the combination of using Recoil alongside React's own state management, you can get super far with that. And that would genuinely be my approach for managing state in React. I would like to use just built-in React state management within components. And then when I need to share some state across my application, I would turn to Recoil to use this, as I'm a big fan of the library. So stay tuned for future videos on how atoms work, selectors, and different things like that. And I'll do some example applications using it as well. And I'll see you in those tutorials.